for this piece. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the policy process and policy tools, and then do a little exercise to have you look at this bill that I was telling you about, the oil and gas one, before we have Jonathan Singer join us at 10:30. So when we talk about the policy process, right, we want to think about the different actors, the different people who are involved in this. And we have lots of different actors at different levels. This is sort of from a, at the federal level, we've got, and at the state level too, we've got, folks that are in the legislature. So that's what we were taking a peek at today, right? And thinking about like, what's the motivation for these different actors? So folks in government are influenced by their own values, but also the incentives and constraints of their institutional setting. So for example, wanting to get reelected, right? Legislative actors want to make good public policy. They want to maintain or earn respect, reflect the views of their constituents. They can, forge coalitions, so decide who else has similar interests and could maybe push a legislative agenda forward. And also, what are the, what are ways to effectively overcome opposition. Administrators, so these are folks that implement the laws that at the federal level are passed by the US Congress. We also have administrators at the state level. And they, really think about the scientific and economic basis to support those regulations. Often there's a lot of leeway and decisions that get made at that implementation stage. And so, it's sort of trying to be true to the intent of the legislation. And also, again, kind of working within the constraints and budgets that they're given. Then we have the judicial branch, so the courts. The federal level, these are reviewing different agency decisions. So right, our system of checks and balances, where they're ensuring that the way that that agencies, that administrators are implementing laws are consistent with the ways that the legislature intended. And also, right, reviewing to see if laws that, if legislation that was passed is consistent with prior laws and the Constitution ultimately. Then we have decision makers at the state and local level. So of course we were taking a look at our state representatives for, what's going on at the Capitol here. At this local level, people are closely aligned with the local needs. And it is, I think we've talked about how the state legislature is really very accessible, that you don't have to have any qualifications to show up and be a part of that. But you can also, at that local level, that's even more the case. Welcome, Jonathan. You're a little early, but I can, so if you want to just listen in for a few minutes, and then I'll hand it over to you. And then thinking about, what's the role of the private sector? So industry, obviously, are the subjects of regulation. They can be leaders in technological innovation, job providers. So I think, having a number of different roles, often in environmental contexts, right? We'll think about industry as sort of an opponent of many of the types of environmental actions that we might be thinking about, but that doesn't have to be the case. And there certainly are private sector innovators in the mix as well. And also, one thing that I'll say about the private sector is that one thing that they often, is very important to them is certainty, right? So having clear rules and having those rules be enforced consistently. So if they're going to have to, build cars that comply with a certain fuel efficiency standard, even if that fuel efficiency standard is higher and might be a little bit more costly for them to do, it's a lot easier for them to do one thing across the country than to build cars for California and then different cars for Nevada, right? And so that consistency and clarity of rules is something that the private sector often advocates for. Lots of actors in the non-governmental space. And again, I'm hoping that Jonathan Singer will tell us a little bit more about sort of a perspective on all of these different actors. And then us in the public health community as well, providing expertise, providing information, and a lot of that, in terms of how much our expertise is listened to has to do with how responsive and good at communicating we are and how we develop relationships. So people, you kind of, when they need an expert to tell them about X, they kind of know who to call. So I think I'm going to skip over a little bit of this. Again, this is some stuff that that Desiree will talk more about. Desiree was not able to come today. She ended up being sick. But just thinking about, right, that there's sort of these models of the policy process that have ideas around, how a concept, a problem gets put on a policy agenda, how policy is formulated around that, then adopted and implemented and evaluated. And these are all helpful models. We know all models, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. So, this is not accurate in any a strict literal sense. Things tend to move all over the place and go in different orders in real life. But thinking about sort of the different pieces of this process and how there are opportunities to be involved and to shape policy through, getting something on the agenda, through working with folks who are implementing it, for example, through doing evaluation of existing policies to see how things are working. So I'm gonna, come back to that. So I think what I'd like to do is go ahead and hand it over. I have, what I had a little bit of background here, Jonathan, that you can, I'll kind of show you what some of these slides are to give a little bit of background on the SB 181 and the background here. So if you'd like me to share a little bit about this just to give students sort of the context, I can do that. Okay, why don't I do that and then kind of let you give the insider's perspective on sort of how this policy change came about and what that has how that's been, what effects that has had since the passage of that bill. So I would say that some of the context for this, and this is an outdated. This only goes to 2013. But I'm gonna play this little animation. This is just from 1990 to 2013. The growth and where this is Greeley, Fort Collins. We've got Denver and Aurora down here, right? So we can just see, and if we were able to continue playing this out for the next 10 years, this would just continue. So massive proliferation in the number of wells and this big shift in the technology being used to develop oil and gas resources. So the old model, the sort of traditional model of oil and gas development was what's called vertical drilling. Very straightforward. If you've got these black dots here are kind of the wells. And so, if you're trying to reach a resource, an oil deposit that's beneath the surface, you drill a well above that. The innovation, the technological innovation with hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking, is two things. First, that so you can drill down and then drill horizontally, which means that you can actually access resources that are all over a wider range from one spot on the surface. And so what that does is gives more flexibility in where these wells get sited, and also leads to what have become these really mega well pads that look much less like sort of what I picture. My grandparents lived in Texas when I was growing up, and there were, a couple of those little oil and gas wells on their property. Didn't have a huge impact, whereas had impacts in other domains, climate change and things like that. But in terms of sort of what the well site was pretty, pretty micro. Whereas now we have these very large, so if you see, right, multi-well pads that can have, I think, upwards of 100 wells on them at this point. And so they become, have much higher impacts on the communities that they're near. And so this is just another visual depiction of sort of the underground network that connects to these larger sites on the surface. And so here's again some other photos around that showing this, these very large multi-well pads and the proximity of those pads to residential sites. Folks in our department, Lisa McKenzie, John Adgate, and Ben Alshouse have done a lot of the scientific work looking at the health impacts of oil and gas development in general and of these large fracking operations in particular. They're definitely, kind of in the lead up to some of these policy changes were concerns around environmental justice and environmental racism, including a segment on The Daily Show highlighting the Bella Romero Academy. So this was an instance where there was a well pad that was proposed to be sited near a school that was 77% white. The parents from that school organized and said, not in our backyard. And the developer said, okay, we'll move the site over here, and ended up successfully building this very large well pad in the backyard of, adjacent to the playground of Bella Romero Academy, which is a school that has 87% students of color. And so this person who's shown here next to The Daily Show's Desi Leidick is Patricia Nelson, who has been just a fierce advocate. She was the mother of one of the children at Bella Romero, and now actually works at Green Latinos as well, and is one of our kind of major environmental justice leaders in the state, and has had a lot of and made a big impact on a lot of these discussions. So meanwhile, there's also in April of 2017 an explosion in a residential community in Firestone that resulted in the deaths of, I think, at least 2 individuals. This was from an abandoned flow line. And so this was, again, in that sort of model of the policy process, I would say one of the things that really bumped this issue to the top of the policy agenda. Lots of organizing work that was happening. So shout out to Logic that Jonathan can tell us a little bit more about. We've again like to talk about a lot of the work that Ian and Green Latinos have done organizing around this. There was also a proposition, so a statewide ballot measure that was proposing to increase the setbacks, so the distance that was required for gas wells to, they would have to have at least this distance when they built from homes. And this was in November of 2018. The ballot measure failed, but it was fairly close. And I think that, kind of helped motivate industry to come to the table and be a part of some of these discussions around how to move forward. So I think this is a good place to hand it over, and Jonathan can correct anything that I misstated, and tell us a little bit more about the history of SB 181 from your perspective, and what came next.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. It's still mornings. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I always like to do a quick sound check. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. All right. Getting the thumbs up and not the middle finger. This is good. I'll wait and see if that trend continues. Anyway, I'm Jonathan Singer, and just by way of introduction, to give you a little sense of who I am. So I was previously, in a previous life, a social worker who worked with kids, elders, people struggling with substance use dependence issues, and was elected to the Colorado State House in 2012, where I represented Niwot, Longmont, Lyons, and Allens Park. That'll come back in a second as to why this is important. And then after my term limits were up, I was able to refocus my efforts, and so I actually took over as an interim executive director for a group called the League of Oil and Gas Impacted Coloradans, or LOGIC, and have since left that job now. As you can see, I'm with the Boulder Chamber, but these views represent Jonathan Singer's views, not the views of any of the organizations that I mentioned or my previous or current employers. So you're going to get the unfiltered me at this point. But with that being said, let me just I just want to do a quick, hand raise exercise here. How many people here have visited the Colorado State House, State Senate before, visited the Colorado General Assembly? Quick show of hands. Virtual hands are okay too. So some people have. All right. How many people have not? All right. So about 50-50. So that's a good sign. So part of my goal today, and remind me how much time I've got here, because I will attenuate that as well, because it looks like Desiree couldn't make it, but glad I'm here.
So this class runs to 11:50. I've got a little bit more, but yeah, you can kind of let's say go till about 11. Does
that works great?
Okay.
So let me take things back a step, and then I'm going to focus on the oil and gas thing. Or actually, let me ask you, because I haven't been to this class before. I also teach a public policy class at Metro State University Denver for Masters of Social Work students. So how many people here are, or in this class? Maybe I'll just ask you, Katie. Have you really talked about what the legislative process is, what that looks like, or is that going to be built in later?
Yeah, so we actually started the day today doing a virtual visit to the Capitol. We turned in and watched the Colorado channel. We've done our, I haven't actually dug up the Schoolhouse Rock video yet, but we have looked at how a bill becomes a law. We've talked a lot about that process, but again, I think just hearing that from the mouth of somebody who has seen that from the inside and outside would be great. But we've got a good foundation. We've talked about first and second readings and all of those different things. So
awesome. Well, so why don't I do? So I'm maybe not going to do the Schoolhouse Rock thing, because I think it sounds like y'all are pretty familiar with that. But I actually have a short and truncated version of sort of like how a bill becomes a law from the perspective of. Did I cut out there for a second?
No, you're good.
Okay, great. I froze, but you heard me, so that's all that matters. I'm gonna actually, if it's okay with you, I've got a brief presentation on what this looks like from the perspective of a lawmaker, and it actually ties in pretty well with the topic that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, that's perfect. Great.
So would you mind if giving me share screen permission? We'll see. Test our Zoom capabilities at 10 o'clock on a Thursday. And in the meantime here, what I will say is I'll cue things up a little bit as the screen share abilities go up. So like I said, I represented Longmont, Lyons, Niwot, Allens Park. 2012, Longmont. This is the year that I was on the ballot. This is the year something else was on the ballot just in the city of Longmont. Just as I was leaving I actually served as a planning and zoning commissioner for the city of Longmont. So this is talking about like the future of cities and development, residential versus commercial, medical, roads, bridges, you name it. We talked about community infrastructure. That was my introduction to public policy on an applied level. And what I'll say is I enjoyed my time on the Planning and Zoning Commission. I loved reading through 200 and 300 page packets, or 10 and 20 page packets, depending on the given month. And so when the opportunity to run for office came up, I jumped at it. And as it turned out, my predecessor resigned her seat, and I was appointed to the seat about 11 months before my first election. And so that by itself was quite a crash course. What else was happening in 2012? Well, the meeting I missed on Planning and Zoning Commission because I had was just getting sworn in at the State House dealt with a proposed oil and gas development in Longmont under Union Reservoir, which was our major water source. So it's also one of our major recreation sources in Longmont. Really big, important issue. So how were people going to deal with this? What was coming up? At the same time that was happening, there was an oil and gas inspection, and the oil and gas inspection was at an abandoned well where levels of cancer-causing chemicals were actually found to be higher than levels deemed safe next to a middle school. Well, guess what gets people upset? Cancer-causing chemicals next to their kids' school, right? And I will say, I can't remember the operator's name right now, the oil and gas operator's name, but the oil and gas operator said, well, yes, it's an abandoned well, and yes, these were cancer-causing chemicals that were found, beyond, what were deemed safe. But we bought this well from a previous operator. It's really their fault. You should go after them, not after us. And it was this passing of the buck that didn't accept any accountability. And so Longmont City Council stepped up and said, you know what? Got this new plan. We're going to regulate the crap out of oil and gas. Because at the time, cities did not have the explicit authority to ban oil and gas operations. And so, one of two things was going to happen. Either the city could, well, one of three things. City could acquiesce to the new plan that was proposed under Union Reservoir. The city could regulate it, or the city could ban it and look at the possibility of getting sued. Well, they said, you know what? We want to regulate it. We're not going to ban it. They got sued anyway. And they didn't just get sued by the operator, but the state of Colorado participated in that lawsuit. That got people upset. That got people engaged. They said, all right, you've got cancer-causing chemicals next to my school. You've got us saying, no, we're not going to ban it, but we want to regulate it, make sure this is done in the safest way possible. Wait, you're suing us? After, another operator told us that the abandoned well wasn't their fault. They were going to, dodge the fines and the fees that were associated with it, which, by the way, those fines and fees had basically been written in 1950 and hadn't changed for over 50 years. You know what we're going to do? We're going to go out, we're going to go get signatures, and we're going to ban fracking in the city of Longmont. And we're not just going to put this in an ordinance. We're going to make this a charter amendment. So a charter amendment in a city council is a lot like changing the US Constitution or the state constitution. What does that mean? That city councilors, even if they wanted to change the city charter, would have to go back to the voters to get permission. So this was a monumental step. And so this is all happening same time that I'm sitting in office. I was on the ballot the same year as the ban on fracking was. I like to remind people that I got about 57% of the vote, a little under 57, it's 56% of the vote. Good for me, right? The ban on fracking in Longmont got 60% of the vote. So there were at least 3,000 people somewhere in Longmont that were like, we're not going to vote. We don't like Singer, and we definitely don't like fracking. I don't know who those 3,000 people were. Kind of curious. By the way, the political demographics in Longmont at the time, this was not a liberal bastion in Colorado. It was about evenly split between Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated voters. So same year I'm on the ballot, the ban on fracking happens. The reason this is important is there's a bipartisan sentiment in should be every governmental body. And that is, if you don't represent your district, someone else will do it for you. And so even oil and gas companies knew that, like, when I was involved in these conversations, even if my personal affiliations and feelings were different than my constituents gave me a pretty freaking clear mandate with 60% of the vote, right? 60% of the vote saying, don't do this. or give us the authority to ban this. That was 2012. So with that, I'm going to give you some context here because I think I do have share screen ability and just walk you through a little bit. And this, like I said, this will be a truncated version of this, but I'm always happy to go further in depth at another time on these things. So, you know, a lot of people haven't served in the state house. There's only 100 lawmakers out there. So I always like to ask people, well, what does it look like? What is it really like? And so a lot of people, I can't see all your faces now because I did a share screen. There we go. So how many people have actually been to the state capitol here? With another quick show of hands. All right, Kristen, if you're able to, unmute for a second, what was the what was that like for you? What were you doing there?
Well, I don't think my experience is maybe the best one to call on because I went to the state capitol in an elementary school field trip. So it was informative, I guess, but not in depth in any way. So
No, I love that because most people when they visit the Capitol, they're like, I haven't been here since fourth grade. So I missed that fourth grade trip because I didn't live here in Colorado. But I'm glad you went. The other question at the time was in the House gallery. Kids would be like, "What's this silver box on the armrest?" And I'm like, "Those are ashtrays because people used to smoke here." And simultaneously, speaking of public health, every single kid would like spontaneously be like, "Ew, that's gross." I'm glad they didn't say, "Ew, that's gross. Why weren't they vaping?" But they're like, "This is disgusting." And so anyway, they got rid of those gallery seats about 5 years ago. Anyone show up at the Capitol, participate in something at the Capitol beyond their fourth grade? Joey, you got your hand up there. I'm just curious what your experience was like.
Yeah, so I explained to everybody earlier. I just went and did testimony on Monday for a bill. Um, it was a little nerve-wracking, finding where you need to go. You know, there's not always directions in there. Trying to make my way up to the third floor and finding the correct room, the person I was with, and you know, we were the first group to speak. I thought I was going to be able to see it like another group speak before our testimony, and it was just so happened we spoke first in the group, and yeah, it's the way the cookie rolls, and I just ran with it. But it's a little nerve-wracking, you're not in your field, you're in somebody else's field.
Fish out of water, right? Yeah. No, I know the feeling. Just to thank you for the honesty in that one. I will tell you when I was sworn in, there are 2-year terms at the state legislature and the House. I was sworn in year 2 of my predecessor's term, and it was year 2 after the session had already been going for a month, and they only meet for 120 days. So I was almost at day 90 or day 30 out of 120 with only 90 days. There. Any other perspectives there? Efren, I saw your hand go up too.
Yeah, last session, I got to work as an intern for State Representative Lorena Garcia.
All right. Well, hopefully that was a positive experience, not just because she's a friend of mine, but she actually works on some pretty critical issues.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Well, that's really good to hear. Well, I'm glad she lost her Senate race so she could participate in the House and give you that experience. One of my former students is actually working with her right now, Mari. So I'm really excited to see the continuation of that. So Efren, like this picture that I'm showing you from like 20 years ago, this is not what it looks like in your legislator's office. There is not a fine, ornate desk with a lot of people who are paid staff who do these things. This is, when I was at the legislature, I had one part-time aide who was making less than $15 an hour. That was it. And so that's not what happened. A lot of people are kind of afraid this is what it looks like. This used to be a joke. Then January 6th happened. But once again, like Efren and other folks here, most days don't look like this. But this is what it looks like on a good day. I'll show you on the right-hand column there, or at least my screen right. Best part of this is, on the right-hand column, I had hair. That was pretty awesome. But in all seriousness, 2 of these pictures are bill signings where the governor had bill signings. And what I'll say for people who have come and testified, the blonde woman in that picture with her kiddo who's missing a tooth because he's of the right age, not because he was playing hockey. was what I like to call my triple threat. She was the instigator of a bill that would have not happened without her. She called me up one day and said, Jonathan, can you believe it? We have mandatory reporters for child abuse in Colorado. Youth sports coaches are not mandatory reporters. Teachers are. If you're employed by a school and you're a coach, you are. But if you run Jonathan Singer's Taekwondo Emporium, you're not required to be a mandatory reporter. And we know, based on what happened with the U.S. Olympic Committee, that that is the wrong thing to do. I call her the triple threat because she was a hockey mom who wrote risk management policies for youth sports organizations and was also a clinical mental health professional that worked with abused and neglected kids. We were able to craft a bill by the beginning of my second year to make sure that youth sports coaches who are on the payroll do actually are actually mandatory reporters of child abuse and neglect in Colorado. Here's a question. Don't use this QR code. It broke. Make sure you're registered to vote where you actually live. Make sure you're registered to vote. And if you're not, it is super freaking easy. It used to be through this QR code, but make sure you do that. I did want to talk briefly about what committee is like. I don't know, Efren, if this is what your feeling was like. This is Larry Summers, the president of Harvard, former president of Harvard, falling asleep while Barack Obama is talking in the foreground. Not sure why he's falling asleep. I don't know if it was boring for you. It sounded like it was a little nerve-wracking. Some people are kind of afraid it looks like, I have to stop with the 90s movie references. Some people are afraid it looks like, two, awesome people yelling at each other. I don't know if people were yelling at you while you were testifying. No? Okay, good. This is kind of what it looks like on an average day. We were dealing with an issue in this picture related to speech and language pathology. This is going to tie actually into oil and gas in a very strange way, believe it or not. But this was a group of speech and language pathologists that said, you know what, Jonathan, I'm getting my degree here. It's subsidized by the University of Colorado. I am leaving as soon as I graduate. All right, tell me more about that. Well, it is easier for me to get my license in 48 other states who allow me to get my clinical hours at the same time that I'm getting my master's degree, and I'm going to have a crap ton of student debt. And while I'd rather stay here, I'd much rather get a full-time job than have to get my clinical supervision hours and continue my debt for another year. That's not fair. I'm like, you're right, that's not fair. We passed a bill unanimously dealing with that issue, which is why we're all smiling in that committee hearing. Here's why you're important, and Efren, you brought such a good perspective to this. We need you, all of you, at the Capitol. First of all, lawmakers ran out of new lawyer jokes like 10 years ago, and I need some new ones. Two, this is so important. You are an expert. You are an expert. You're an expert in your own experience, in your own field, in your own lives. You know things. You might expect lawmakers to know everything about everything. The first time I went to the state capitol, I was at a legislative breakfast. I got out 2 words, good and morning, because I was afraid that anything I said after that wasn't going to land. Turns out I knew a lot about why I was there and what my experiences were actually in the city of Fort Collins, and it would have directly informed those lawmakers, and I lost an opportunity for representative democracy to work. I also didn't embarrass myself, so that was a win. But this is how a bill becomes a law. No, this is not how a bill becomes a law. This is bribery. Don't do this. It's illegal, and no one wears suspenders anymore. You've already seen this, how a bill is supposed to become a law. Every lawmaker gets at least 5 bills in Colorado, and each of those bills gets a public hearing. That's not like what happens at the federal level. I'm going to do a quick trivia question here. You may not know the answer to this, but we want to keep things moving. So in Colorado, after a bill is passed by the House and the Senate, gets those public hearings, the governor has 3 choices, right? Sign, veto, or don't sign the bill. Any guesses as to what happens to a bill when when it's not signed by the governor? Anyone can shout this one out because I'm not looking at the chat. Remember, it's a guess, so even if you guess wrong, you don't lose any points. All right, shoot, Efren.
The governor doesn't veto it or sign on it, it still gets passed, I think, after 5 or 10 days. I can't remember.
Yeah, so wow, we got high degree of specificity there. But yes, essentially, depending on the time of year it's happening, the governor doesn't sign a bill in Colorado. that's passed both the chambers, it actually becomes law without their signature. This is unique to Colorado, actually. Most places, there's what's called a pocket veto, which means the governor doesn't sign something, it just doesn't become law. We're a little different, unique in Colorado. So this is how a bill really becomes law. And I want you guys to take a look at this. I'm glad that somebody loves looking at the chat now, the 90s references. So I feel slightly less old. Anyway, this is how a bill really becomes a law. Lobbyists, right? You know, whether you're paid or unpaid as a lobbyist, there are people there that focus their time, effort, and energy, and with such paltry staff, not paltry in terms of knowledge, but paltry in terms of numbers, for lawmakers, lobbyists have a huge outsized impact in Colorado. And the next one that I'm going to refer to a little bit later is community building. If you don't represent your district, someone else will do it for you. I'm going to refer to that in just a second too. Elections make a difference, and committee testimony makes a difference. Efren, I'm gonna lean on you. If I say 33-18-1, what is that? Does that mean anything to you specifically?
It does, but I cannot recall.
Okay, so this is really important. Anyone else, like, any idea what the significance might be? I'm gonna not pause for too long on this one, but any idea what the significance of 33-18-1 are?
Actually, I think it might be the majority, right? Like the number of like individuals per party.
Well, correct.
Oh.
So not per party, but per chamber. So
Okay.
so there's 65 members of the House, 35 members of the Senate, makes for an even 100 lawmakers. 33 is a simple majority in the House, 18 in the Senate, the governor. So if I've got a controversial bill, let's say on oil and gas, and I don't have my 33 votes, and let's say there's a lawmaker from Weld County, high oil and gas producing part of the state, and they're in a swing district, and I go to them and I say, you know, look, Representative so-and-so, I really need your vote on my bill dealing with oil and gas. And they might look back at me and go, like, well, Representative Singer, do you have your 33-18-1? Look, I got my 33 to pass it in the House, but I'm not there on the 18, and the governor, like, I need to show that Weld County supports this bill. Well, Jonathan, until you get your 18 in the Senate, like, I can't be there. My constituents, it's too fractured of an issue, forgive the pun, too fractured of an issue. Like, come back to me when you get your 18, and I will help you make sure that the governor gets the message. Or, Jonathan, I'm not there with you at all. Don't count me as part of your 33. Count. Simple arithmetic is very important when you're advocating, and it's not just there, but it's on committees, on the committee level as well. And I want to thank our good lawmakers and our great interns and students, because they really do sacrifice and spend a lot of time. I didn't know we were going to have one here today. So this is what legislators don't do. They can't afford 3 martini lunches. Most legislators make about $40,000 a year at the state capitol, less than most first-year teachers in Colorado. So that's out, and you can't bribe them. So Kids Against Fracking showed up. I represent Longmont. You bet I was sitting there listening to them. That's what I would do for lunchtime. Breakfast, hearings on the top issues of the day. Dinner, packed committee rooms, even if it wasn't on an issue or on a committee that I sat on. In 2013, lots going on around gun violence prevention. You bet that I was getting a lot of phone calls about this issue. So you know what? I took the time to come to that public hearing and listen to what people had to say till about 11 o'clock at night when I went home. Even at midnight. And I'm going to close on this, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about oil and gas, because this ties in perfectly. 2012 wasn't just about oil and gas. Democrats were in the majority in the state Senate. Republicans were in the majority in the state House by 1 seat that was held by about a margin of about 200 votes. Slimmest of majorities. Marriage equality was not a thing in 2012. I don't know if people remember this. And so civil unions was potentially the only chance we had at seeing something like marriage equality in Colorado, which was historically known as the hate state, for banning things like same-sex marriage in our state constitution. Thanks, voters. So we worked to change this. It passed the Senate. In the House, it faced a steep challenge because of that majority. Majorities matter. Majority of elected officials were Republican. But guess what? Passed out of 3 committees in the state House. It came to the House floor. On the day that it came to the House floor towards the end of the legislative session, I'll give you the short version of the story. The Speaker of the House was a Republican. He wanted to stick up for some of his other conservative colleagues. And the only way to kill that bill was to not hear it that night, was to force it to basically be on the agenda and not be heard through a parliamentary move, as opposed to, using traditional fair, in my opinion, fair process. So at about 11 o'clock at night, the Speaker puts the House of Representatives into recess, and basically is like, look, 40 bills are going to die today, including this one, because that's more important than anything else at this point in time. And so when that became apparent, in the top right-hand and left-hand corner, you'll see these brass railings. There's a gallery where anyone can watch proceedings. And in that gallery, what happened was somebody got wind of what was happening, was explained what was happening, and they yelled from the gallery to the General Assembly, "I hope you all die." At that point, the sergeants at arms were like, all right, everyone out of the gallery, they're in recess, they're not meeting, there's no public meeting happening. You guys can get out of here too. Sorry, like this can't happen. As you can see, I stayed on the House floor. And the reason I stayed is because we technically did have another hour. We had until 11:59 p.m. to pass that bill. And some people had been waiting their entire lives to enjoy the rights that my wife and I are able to enjoy. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to stay online. I'm going to stay on social media. You guys are angry. If you have questions, you want to know what's happening, what the next steps are. Part of representative democracy is me responding to that. And the other part is doing my job until I can no longer do it. So I will be here for the next hour virtually to answer your questions and provide you with the knowledge of what just occurred and what we can do next, assuming no one comes back at 11:59 p.m., which they didn't. So the Democrats were in the majority, or the minority in the House there by 1 vote, 33 Republicans, 32 Democrats. The Democrats took 7 more seats in the 2012 election, 39, moving from 32 to 39. Now there's a virtual supermajority of Democrats. Those kinds of bills don't, while they're still controversial, pass every single time. And the Democrats have not lost the majority in the House since 2012. So do elections have consequences? You bet. It's the majority leader and the Speaker, or the President of the Senate and the majority leader in the Senate, that decide who sits on a committee, what happens in those committees, who makes, how those votes might even transpire. They can't tell people how to vote, but they can certainly give strong indications in leadership, party leadership. So the table is set. So I'm not going to give you this case study because I want to walk through it, but I do want to share with you the very last slide here. Actually, 2 slides here. One, we do need you in this process, and so I'm going to tell you what we were able to accomplish at Logic. And I'm going to leave my phone number up here, but you can also, I'll put it in the chat. That's my cell phone. That's my email address. I want you to be able to reach out to me anytime. And I'm going to stop the share screen here. And before I talk about what this all has to do with oil and gas, any questions about process or policy so far from the perspective of a former lawmaker? If not, I'm going to jump straight into it. So you'd think getting...
Jonathan, I'm going to show you some pictures of cute kids. So this is me and my middle child, who's now 12, at the state capitol in March of 2013 with our state senator at the time, Matt Jones. We were there testifying in support of the civil unions bill.
Oh, all right.
Cute kiddos at the Capitol.
What I say about kids at the Capitol is the more children we have at the Capitol,
Mhm.
the more that adults will start to act like adults around kids. I think it's true. I really do, which is why some people push against having kids at the Capitol in the first place. So yeah, no, I brought my daughter with me every Friday from age 5 months to 5 years old, and she actually insisted on skipping school last week so she'd come to the Capitol with me.
Oh, that's great.
So my son, who's younger, is like, "This place is not for children, Dad. Don't take me back there." I'm like, "You're right. There's way too much alcohol and not enough candy." So what does this mean in terms of oil and gas operations? What I will say is, so Senate Bill 181 passed in 2019. So Longmont's over here getting sued 7 years earlier in 2012, passing a charter amendment that, fell victim to a lawsuit. So the mandate out of Longmont for those representatives was to continue to impress upon people the need for change. So 2012, interesting year. Right? Democrats took the House back. The Senate was still in Democratic hands. Not every Democrat knew what fracking was. They thought it was maybe some reference to a 4-letter word or maybe a Battlestar Galactica thing. They weren't sure. So still a new concept. So a lot of education had to happen. And also at the same time, you saw Patricia Nelson there. As this started to encroach on neighborhoods, this wasn't just an environmental issue, this became a neighborhood issue. And what you were seeing in the Colorado General Assembly in 2012, 2013, 2014 was a lot of environmentalists showing up. That's great. Some public health officials showing up, also great. And then a lot of oil and gas lobbyists showing up, also part of the process, nothing wrong with that. What they didn't really have were those impacted neighbors, the people that were saying, "This is happening in my backyard. This is what's happening to me." And that's where people like Patricia really made an impact. And there was no model in the movement to really say, our prime focus isn't going to be policy. It's not going to be community activism. It's going to be about bringing neighbors together to give them the tools to speak truth to power. And so Logic was formed actually by my former campaign manager, Sarah Laughlin, who's now at Progress Now Colorado, to say, this is the new model, because the human to human interaction, just like my triple threat, my constituent who was also a mental health professional who wrote risk management policies, we needed more folks of that nature being able to speak their truth, but we needed to give them the tools so they knew which frickin' room to go to, let alone like how to talk in 2 to 3 minutes at a committee hearing, or how to lobby their elected official in the Capitol building or at a town hall meeting. And so this was a very different space that was, wasn't your typical left-wing activism, and it wasn't your typical sort of, policy wonky expertise. It was bringing a community organizing model to something that hadn't really enjoyed those resources in the past. So what happened in 2013? Like we banned fracking, right? No, not really. I worked on, so what did we want to do? Expand the number of oil and gas inspectors in the state of Colorado. Well, that makes sense, right? Turns out that the number of oil and gas inspectors that we had in 2012, 2013, it would take about 3 years to get to every well in Colorado. Okay, well, but these wells are operating 24/7. Is this the best thing, or should we inspect wells at least once a year? Seems like a good idea. Let's go do that. So what do we need to do that? We needed to quadruple the number of oil and gas inspectors. That did not happen. I ran an amendment with State Senator Matt Jones actually to do that very thing. And I ran an amendment on our budget, state budget, to fund this. We were going to fund, without raising taxes, to fund it through an environmental response plan. And all this pushback came from folks. You can't do this. It's going to cost too much. No, I told you how we're going to pay for it. You can't do this. This is, an overstep. This is overregulation, like, well, maybe we wouldn't have banned fracking if we had known that these wells would be inspected. So we wouldn't have the cancer causing chemicals next to our middle school. Well, this is still an overstep. And I'm like, so pretty sure we have more oil and gas lobbyists sitting in the lobby just outside the House floor right now than we do oil and gas inspectors in the state of Colorado. The lobby, which is a physical place, broke up with laughter because they're like, holy crap, Jonathan's right. Like, there's more of us than there are inspectors. This is a little uncomfortable. So long story short on that one, the Senate originally said, no, we don't want to quadruple the number. We compromised. We doubled the number of oil and gas inspectors. I also passed a bill that year with bipartisan support, believe it or not, on changing how oil and gas wells are inspected using risk management. This is something that's done in engineering all the time. What are the most dangerous times that we have, right? And within that context, we said, look, let's just use a risk-based analysis, and on top of that, let's do an audit of our wells, a nonpartisan audit. That nonpartisan audit is going to come back in a little bit, because guess what happens several years later? A home in Firestone explodes due to an uncapped well or due to an uncapped flow line that was not correctly cut off. People who lived in that home were actually pretty pro oil and gas. They were not opposed to this. But this was a seminal moment in Colorado history because this issue could no longer be ignored. And it was literally, this wasn't the deleterious effects of a single moment in time, but this was in fact looking at a much broader perspective of things, and also taking into account a very specific act. This was the catalyzing moment for Senate Bill 191. Senate Bill 191 was actually the conglomeration of multiple bills that had died, not just increasing the number of oil and gas inspectors, but changing the mission of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, which has since actually changed its name, professionalizing that board, saying, you know what, look, we just can't have volunteers here. We can't have a conflict of interest, because the Conservation Commission at the time had conflicting rules, right? They were actually required to do two things in their mission: promote the industry and protect the environment. Not using technical words here, but those almost bright line, those were the words, is to promote the industry while at the same time protecting people and the environment. That was a dual role. We said, look, promotion of the industry, we feel like there's a lot of that that's going on right now. Maybe we should put one thing a level above the other. How about that for once? Setbacks. This is how far you can have an oil and gas operation from a home. Setbacks were moved from 500 feet to 2,000 feet. Setbacks were also increased in terms of where the setback actually happens. And it required, at the permitting process, interaction with those neighbors that were most affected. So what happens after a bill passes and it's signed by the governor? Lawmakers high five, they go home, right? Maybe they go run for re-election. Administrators freak the crap out. Why? Because they've got to go write some rules now about how are you going to implement this. So Logic was very involved in bringing neighbors to the rulemaking hearings to say, this is how we want to see things proceed, and make sure that we're doing things the right way. All right, Katie, remind me, how am I doing on time here?
You're great. Yeah, if you want to wrap up in like 15 minutes.
Great. So what I'll do is I'll talk for another couple of minutes, then I really want to take questions. How about that? Yeah. So we were eminently involved in that. Bringing 191 was a culmination of all of these different bills across that period of time. Logic was in the room with the governor's staff, with other interested stakeholders, with lawmakers to say, how are we going to do this? And I'll say, in the first initial drafts, was the oil and gas industry eminently consulted on every single part of this? Absolutely not. Were they engaged in the room as various iterations of this bill were debated and discussed? Absolutely. They were given a seat at the table just like everybody else. Now, that doesn't mean that they got everything that they wanted, but when we talk about when things are implemented, how things are implemented, timelines and specifics, there were more than a handful of amendments that were accepted by Democrats from Republicans on those very issues and from the oil and gas industry on those oil and gas issues. Part of that was the spirit of compromise. Part of that was because the 33, 18, and 1, those votes weren't necessarily there in each of those chambers. So, knowing what we knew then, this passed, COGCC exists. 2020, I'm term limited, I'm out of office. I start to step in a role in Logic. I get this email from the now former state senator Mike Foote, who was part of our team. Mike Foote's like, hey, I saw this permit pulled in sort of the Dacono Firestone area, and it looks like it's kind of within 2,000 feet of some homes. What's going on with that, Jonathan? Like, good point, Mike. Let's start figuring this out. At the same time, a woman who actually had been a constituent of mine but had moved out to Firestone started a change.org petition because she had heard about this permit. She started collecting all these signatures on change.org. So we give her, so Logic gives her a call and they're like, hey, thanks for that petition. And she's like, yeah, I don't know how these things work, but I figured I'd start something, right? And we're like, yeah, that's great. And, our guy over here saw some things and is equally concerned. So let's get coffee. So we sit down with this individual and she's like, Jonathan, I never thought I would be involved in these things. I didn't even know there were groups like yours out there. And I'm like, yeah, there's basically us, at least in this region. And so this is like, you are part of our mission. You were actually doing part of our mission without, knowing it. How can we work together? So we provided some of the industry expertise and some of the political expertise to say, okay, look, at this point, with the new mission change that has only now been implemented. Remember, the bill passed in 2019. Full implementation didn't really happen for another couple of years because it takes time to change things. What we now know, based on additional setbacks, is that neighborhood input is more important than it's ever been. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to do some old-fashioned organizing. Mind you, this is COVID, so a little tough. We're masking up. We're going out there knocking on doors saying, look, we're not Mormons and we're not here to sell you anything. But did you know that like literally in your backyard, there's a proposed plan right now to build an oil and gas operation. Some people were like, okay, that sounds fine. And we would say, great. Like, if you think that's fine. Here's why we're concerned. I don't know what you thought this might look like, but we're talking about a multi-story noisy operation with lights running 24 hours a day, potentially, sound impacts, road impacts. And they're like, oh, I thought this was like a little 20-foot pump jack that would be sitting, 10-foot pump jack that would be sitting somewhere kind of. I just moved here, Jonathan. This is a brand new development. I was told I would get these beautiful views. Now, this may not be like the most compelling thing for most people is this suburban white middle class argument, right? We weren't talking about air quality, nosebleeds, headaches, any of those things. They were like, I just spent like $800,000 on this house and you're telling me it's now going to be worth $600,000? I'm like, I'm not telling you that. I'm telling you what's happening across the street. Well, what do I do? Well, great. We're going to have this neighborhood meeting on Zoom, right? You go to the next door and the next door and the next door, and you leave a flyer and you leave a notice and you reach out to people within the setback area and say, look, you're in the area, but your voice is going to count. So bad news is Firestone, Dacono, the city councilors approved the permit. Local government, we wanted to give them the power in Senate Bill 181 to do something about this. Local government says, oh yeah, no, we're going to do this land swap and they're going to give us space for parks and this is going to be great. Don't worry about it, folks. Well, apparently the folks in the neighborhood were still pretty worried. So as we continued organizing on Zoom, there's a hearing that's coming up at the State Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. And the conversations that we had were really powerful because one, people were getting a crash course, but two, neighbors were getting to know neighbors. And this is what, this is something that I say is even more powerful than anything else that I'm talking about today, is in a politically fractured period of time when we all feel maybe a little bit more alone in the world, people were actually talking to each other safely, socially distancing through Zoom and other things. And we didn't know what was going to happen because this law had been untested. We didn't know what was going to happen when we went in front of the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. And so we wanted to manage expectations. And so my deputy, Andrew, and I were in these meetings, and one of the neighbors piped up and they said, I get it. Like, thank you for being here. We're going to keep pushing, but win or lose, I'm so glad that I got to know each and every one of you, because now I live in a community. Now we're neighbors. I care whether we win or lose, but what's happening here today is almost more important than that. And so the next time an issue comes up, we're going to be able to talk to each other. So we go in front of the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We bring the neighbors to the table. Now, as you can imagine, oil and gas started to catch wind of what we were doing. They may have paid some folks to go out, canvass some neighborhoods, talk to some constituents. But what happened during that hearing, and it was long, this is multiple hours. I listened to online and it was pretty intense. You heard from people that weren't in the district that were like, I'm an oil and gas worker and I don't want to lose my job, or I believe in energy independence and this is going to take away from our energy independence by banning something like this. You can't take this away. This is going to affect international markets, and these were from people who have good ideas. But here's the one thing. None of those folks from any of the opposition camp actually lived in the area. And so now we start to hear from neighbors and neighbors and neighbors and neighbors. And to a T, every single one of them brings up a very similar concern. They sound like they're repeating some talking points, but also making some very clear individual points about why they moved to Firestone, what they expected and what they are afraid of now. And fundamentally, they're like, look, the law says that you can stop oil and gas operations that are within 2,000 feet of a residential neighborhood. I'm a resident and I'm telling you to stop this. The deliberation happens, and almost to a T, every single oil and gas commissioner, including the representative from the industry, shared their disappointment with the fact that the industry wasn't able to engage any neighbors in the neighborhood when that was the primary function of the issue that was going on. And so the ban on that development happened with one dissenting vote, that one dissenting vote being the person who was the oil and gas industry representative, who also was similarly not thrilled with this. And so why is this important? This is important because this process started probably before 2012, but for me in 2012, it took 7 years to pass a bill. It took another year to implement that bill. And it took another several months worth of effort of organizing to actually get the right voices to the right decision makers. And without that long haul approach to these issues, whether or not you agree with what the bill did or the issue itself, this is a long haul issue, like everything in life and in politics. And I was grateful to be able to see this from the outset and see a concept I had worked on turned into a bill that later became a policy that was later correctly implemented because of organizing efforts on the ground. And so, and this is not to brag about myself. I've left Logic since then. I work for a different employer now. But these are the kinds of things that you have the power to do. And I say that because I've done it. I've seen other people do it. And your voice is so critical to these kinds of conversations. So anyway, that's what I've got. I'm happy to take a few questions for a little bit and make sure that we are all connected.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Really appreciate your time with us today. Questions? So yeah, I'll start with one. So I mean, yeah, I think this view that you have of, you know, really soup to nuts, as they say, right? Just from being a community member who was very engaged and, you know, starting at that local level, to, you know, being in the halls of power, to, you know, leaving those halls of power and really working with the people power. And where you are now, right, with the county. And I think so one of the things that's really you know, one of the things that I really try to convey and give folks a sense of in this class is really just that sense of, you know, how all of us can be a part of the policy story, and there's so many different roles to play. And we can play those roles at different times in our life. We can play those roles for, you know, there might be something that professionally, you know, you can be that triple threat because it's a policy that's within your area of expertise. And there can be another area where it's just something that you care a lot about, right? And so you just get to be that engaged constituent and informed voter. So, you know, I think as students of public health, you know, thinking about these next moves that they're all going to be making in terms of, you know, choices in their career, you know, I think if you have any insights or advice on, you know, how to make those decisions, how to decide where to jump in. And then you know, the other thing I always like to have people reflect on is, you know, how did you stay hopeful in that long trajectory of things not going your way, right? So you know, any self-care, self-maintenance strategies to keep, you know, be able to have the stamina to keep going through that whole process.
It's a really important question, actually. And sadly, I've only got about 5 minutes, and then the bus is. So one quick correction: so I'm not with the county. I work with Boulder Chamber of Commerce now. But yeah. So, but yeah, I applied for a county job, but the voters decided otherwise. So, so self-care, incredibly important. So you know, I was a caseworker before this. I will say that I let gallows humor help me the most. And on top of so you know, an example of safer work gallows humor was, you know, I talked about this. The legislature, you wanted to keep the right caffeine to alcohol ratio. That has a law of diminishing returns that is very dehydrating. So I don't necessarily recommend that you follow my recommendations on that. I will say, you know, just on a personal note, that, you know, obviously, you know, like 2020 was a seminal moment in all of our lives in a certain way. And I've taken a lot more time for self-care since then. And I didn't take the time that I needed. And there's something called a hedonic treadmill. So those pictures of bill signing ceremonies, I didn't really care about bill signing ceremonies, to be honest. I was like, all right, when do we get to start to work on the next big thing? Like, we've only got so much time, guys. And so the good news is no one has showed up to my next meeting, so I'm okay for another couple minutes.
Okay.
So what I would say is check in with yourselves, check in with each other. That's incredibly important. Build in time. In my own classes, when I teach now, at least 3 times throughout the semester, I will do check-ins where I'm like, hey, like, we're gonna take like half an hour right now. Like, tell me about, like, what's your rose? What's your bud? What's your thorn? Like, what are you excited about? What are you worried about, or what's causing you pain right now? And you know, and you know, what's going well, you know, and that has really informed me and also built a more cohesive, you know, unit. But it is important to find different ways. Some people it's family, some people it's not family, some people it's, you know, whatever it is. You may not feel like there's the time to do it. The law of diminishing returns will eventually catch up, and you know, if you don't decide for yourself, the world will decide for you. And so take the time that you need now, and you know, be courageous about that.
Time for one more. Jared's got a hand up.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Sean, for everything you said. Referring to getting the community involved when you went door to door for the oil and gas scenario. I'm curious when it came to like speaking to the individual, what do you focus on? Do you focus on the health implications that could be affecting them, the economic? Like, is there any degree, like what are the main highlights and how do you convince them to be a part of your
Well, it's actually the same. Yeah, it's a great question. I use the same tactic. It shouldn't even be called a tactic, but the same approach I use with, lawmakers, my kids, and people that I meet at the door. One is, I try to very much, it's something in social work called motivational interviewing. And motivational interviewing isn't about figuring out how to interview people or figuring out how to motivate people to do what you want. It's figuring out what motivates people. And so the delivery changed a little bit, but I would say like, hey, my name's Jonathan Singer. I work with a nonprofit, so I start with that. So I'm not from the church. I'm like, work with a nonprofit, group that helps neighbors out on impacts to their community, and we're really and I'll be very succinct. Like we're concerned. There's something happening right behind your oil and gas development that's happening right behind your door, literally, that's coming in, and we've heard from other neighbors, your neighbors, I should say. We've heard from your neighbors that they're concerned about tons of industrial road trips, noise impacts, 24/7 lights. There's a ton of other things. We're just here as a resource to help, your neighbor out. And we wanted to make sure that you were informed about these things. Has anyone actually talked to you about this before? No. Well, actually, did you know by law, the operator was supposed to reach out to you already? Oh, really? Yeah, no. And so, okay, now the conversation's going, right? Well, here's what we know. We've been in other communities before, and this is what's happened. But the good news is now we can give people the tools to stop this or slow it down. We're going to have an informational meeting on Thursday. Here's a flyer with a QR code on Zoom. We'd love for you to be there, right? And so it's a couple of things. It's a short conversation. It's not a lecture. It was listening to the neighbors' concerns ahead of time. So the pump was primed. I could already talk about what other people were already concerned about. So hopefully there was that commonality. It was relating to them in some way. Hey, I live just down the road in Longmont. I work for a nonprofit. Here's what we do. And then, and the last thing, and this is so important, is making the hard ask, right? Whatever that hard ask is, can I count on you to come to this meeting that's happening with your neighbors, that your neighbor is holding on Thursday at 7 p.m.? Oh, I can't make it. I get it. Like, we'd love to keep you apprised of things. Can we get, what's the best way to get back with you so we can let you know when the next meeting is happening? Oh, I'm not really interested. Okay, I'm going to move on, right? Save some time. Oh, yeah, I'd love to give you my name. Here we go. So it's not just feeling good about the conversation. It's not just motivating people, but it's also making that hard ask. So there's an art form to it. I can take one more question. So.
Yeah, I don't hopefully I phrased this appropriately. And I don't know if we have time to get into it. I'm just curious, is it commonplace when like these new laws and things are made to consider the influence on like other communities, so to speak, right? Because it seems almost inherent with public health policy that it's going to at least oftentimes affect, say, business friendliness, right? So I guess the concern would be if you say, from the article about the waste disposal site in California being in a poor area and the citizens getting together to protect their own health. But then if that just shifts that hazard to another community, I guess what I'm asking is the focus really just on your community and your constituents? And I'm not singling you out, just like overall. And if not, like what's the process then to try and communicate your ideas with other communities, be it counties or states or whatever?
So a couple things. No one showed up to my next meeting, which I'm very disappointed about. Speaking of communities, so a couple things. One, disproportionately impacted communities tend not to feel empowered for good reasons, right? To participate in our democratic process system of representative government. And so, I tell people, like, you represent your constituents or else someone else will do it for you. So the NIMBY argument, the not in my backyard argument, when we're talking about, predominantly white affluent areas, can oftentimes be some of the most successful arguments. And I will be very transparent in saying that, while Logic has worked and did a lot of work with disproportionately impacted communities, Firestone, part of Firestone I was in, not disproportionately impacted in terms of race or affluence, right? These were upper middle class individuals who were highly resourced, who had the free time or were able to take the free time to show up to committee hearings, to participate in the process. And so, the question is, how do you build in these additional safeguards and structures to ensure that everybody's voice is heard? Because I'll tell you, oil and gas had more lobbyists than we had oil and gas inspectors in the state, right? That by itself, is just one component of this. And so we try to be globalistic when we talk about these things, holistic when we talk about these things. Doesn't necessarily come to fruition in that regard. And so it doesn't necessarily come to fruition in that regard. And so what I'll say is, on that level is it is a work in progress. You represent your district, or else someone else will do it for you. But at the same time, I always say it's the Colorado General Assembly, not the Longmont General Assembly. So if I'm not taking into account what an oil and gas worker is going to experience, if I'm not taking into account those things, I may be representing my district, but I may not be taking my civic charge seriously enough. And so this is a balance. And the only way to achieve that balance is to provide the time and space for people to be able to bring those voices to the forefront. And this is a really hard, challenging aspect because the cost of housing is going up, which means that people need more jobs, and means they have less time to dedicate to things that might affect them. And so that's why it's incumbent on all of us to start to create those spaces and to start thinking about these things consciously. I ask myself this question all the time in all of these conversations is, when we accomplish something and it helped out or didn't help out a certain community, was that a feature of the policy or is it a bug, right? Was it something we missed or is there something systemic? Economic injustice, racism, environmental injustice, was that put in place on purpose? Or was that just an oversight? And fundamentally doesn't matter. And so now you see in conversations, I'll actually bring you an example of this. There's a bill to increase or to continue the zero fare for better air program and creating, free bus transit for people, on a longer term basis. And also setting up a commission to look at a statewide transit pass. Super freaking exciting. A ton of people showed up that were like, so you're setting up this new process and I don't see anyone from a disproportionately impacted community. We're not saying this is a bad idea, but what we are saying is it's not going to work the way you want it to work unless you include people from, I don't know, Commerce City, right? Not to pick on them, but I will. So anyway, that's the crux of it. And so anyway, I'm going to have to leave it at that because I have to run, but I did leave my contact information. I'm always thrilled and inspired to be part of these conversations because public health officials I consider they were literally my neighbors when I worked for Department of Housing and Human Services, and the work you do is so. If it wasn't appreciated before, hopefully COVID shined a light on it and gave people a brighter perspective of things. And so keep doing what you're doing and then come back and talk to me.
Absolutely. Jonathan, thank you for being so generous with your time, sharing all of this amazing perspective and story. Thank you for sharing your contact information. I'm sure you'll have students following up with you. It was great to see you. I'm so glad we ran into each other and and that you could make it today. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, the six degrees of Chambers of Commerce.
That's
We're
right,
at a
exactly.
Chamber of Commerce event, and I wouldn't be here without it. Once again, community coming to talk to
Community, that's what it's all about.
Exactly. All right. Well, I'll hopefully see you all at the next thing. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.